actually one of my favorite talks to give, called the Startup Operating System. For many of you, it'll be a trip down memory lane, both favorable and unfavorable memories, probably the way startups go. And for some of you, this will be a peek kind of backstage into what life might be like as a startup founder. I want to set the stage with just a few concepts and insights first before we dive into a little bit more about an individual founder. And any of you that know me know that I love quotes, and I have my collection of favorite quotes. And this one is from the 1700s from Voltaire. And I'll make it more gender neutral as I modify it slightly. But every person is the creature of the age in which they live. Very few are able to raise themselves above the ideas of the time. Really hard to do. And for those of you that have children, you know that imagination and creativity are not a problem. Children are born with an abundance of these two characteristics. And these are two characteristics that serve as a foundation for innovation. And if you think about innovation, well, startups are mostly or exclusively about innovation. Unfortunately, as we go about aging, and especially into our adult lives, for a lot of us, that raw imagination and creativity starts to drift further and further away from the way we think. But children obviously have no problems with it at all. And it also just so happens that entrepreneurs tend to see things differently than the rest of the world. And I find that to be true with the thousands of entrepreneurs that I interact with over years. And for those of you that read Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, the very first paragraph of the very first chapter, he has this quote: "What important truth do very few people agree with you on?" So it's this imagination and creativity manifested in a way that sees the world differently. That makes it kind of interesting because many of us might think your idea is kind of crazy. Well, is crazy good or is crazy bad? Are you just seeing things differently than the way the rest of the world does? So let me just give you an example of kind of how dramatic the difference is that we might see things. On the left, I have an image of a woman. And this woman is either 25 years old, give or take, or 75 years old, give or take. You might be wondering, how is that possible? If I said 25 or 30, yeah, that's kind of close. It might be difficult. If I said 70 or 80, it might be kind of close, maybe kind of difficult. Put in the chat feed kind of what you think this age, that this woman's age is, if you had to guess between 25 and 75. Let's see if I can see the chat myself while I'm talking, but give just a second for you all to do that. 25s, I see some 85s. I don't know the research on this as to how evenly split it is. I really don't. Give just a second more just to show the diversity. Lots of more see the 25 than the 75. All right. So for those of you that it was kind of a difficult exercise, here's another colorized version of it. And this is one of those kind of trick pictures images, because there are both women in this image. And what happens is if you see the 25-year-old woman first, you latch onto that and it's almost impossible to see the 75-year-old woman. And the opposite is also true. And if you can't see both of them now, and I don't have time to explain it, just do a YouTube search on old or young woman illusion, and you will find animated versions of this that will help reveal the two. And I promise, if all you see is the 25-year-old woman, as soon as it's revealed to you who the 85-year-old woman is, it'll be kind of mind-boggling. So this is what I mean by like seeing things differently and getting locked into certain ways of doing things. So now let's jump into kind of the world of a startup. Let's birth a startup. You know, they're in a coffee shop. In the beginning, there are often two, prospective co-founders that are riffing on an idea. They've got some passion. They mix that with some coffee and a blank sheet of paper, write down a lot of assumptions. And, almost like that, a startup is born. It used to take a long time and a lot of money to start a startup. Now, almost as soon as you have the idea, you could claim at the very next cocktail party that you go to that you have a startup. And that's kind of a unique attribute that's happening in this day and age, I'll say, and I'll explain a little bit of that why in just a minute. But I find that the founders that are in that coffee shop riffing on ideas that bring forth their personal passions, mostly personal passions for the problem they intend to solve, those are the ones that usually have the fortitude to make it through and have some chance of actually turning into a company. And if you can turn it into a real company, you have a chance of becoming a great company. Founders that have this personal passion for the problem they're solving will work a lot harder, tirelessly, endlessly. They'll work for no salary during a bootstrapping phase and extremely low salary phase once they're initially funded. They'll have kind of this weird deafness to the word no. The smartest ones will hear no and ask, do they need to make an adjustment? But no means something different to a startup founder than most of the rest of it. It's not a dejecting kind of word like the most of us, when we hear the word no from a parent or a boss, we hear it in a different way than founders do. They'll usually bootstrap by using their day job to pay their bills so that they can moonlight their startup, or maybe they'll raise a little bit of money from some friends and family, and just like that, they're off to the races. And when I say just a little bit of funding, I really mean it. A few years ago, Upfront Ventures kind of produced a report, and I don't know what data they exactly use for this. And the truth is, I don't even know if it's exactly true, but the order of magnitude is true. Around the turn of the century, we had to raise millions of dollars before we could write our first lines of code for a software company, and a hardware company, God forbid, had to raise a pile of money. That has dramatically been reduced over time. Through prevalence of open source software, and not just cloud computing, but free hosting credits for that cloud computing, co-working spaces and the like, that just dramatically reduce the cost of getting a startup started. I'm not necessarily saying you can get a product in the market on $5,000, but to kind of get something started and start writing some lines of code, yeah, it just doesn't cost very much at all. So that's a little bit of stage setting. Let's look at what I call the startup operating system. What is it that makes a startup founder tick? Well, one is a level of risk-taking that most are not comfortable with. In fact, it's going to be one of the first things that is a test of a new entrepreneur. Are they willing to take these risks and feel at least somewhat comfortable with it? Or do they just, royally freak out and do nothing but stress all of the time? It's this nothing to lose and everything to win mentality. Just jump off. This particular jumper probably didn't check the parachute if he or she is an entrepreneur. There's also this level of out of control that happened that you have to get used to. And I love this graphic of this woman going around this skiing race. I don't know if it's Lindsey Vonn or who it is, but there's this always on the verge of out of control. And as you look at this image, is she going to make it? Like, is she going to recover, or is she going to crash and burn? And startup founders that are pushing the pedal to the metal all the time, they regularly feel that way. Are we about to crash and burn, or are we going to turn the corner and just massively explode on the other side of this? They pretty quickly learn that their most valuable resource is time. In the early days, they think that their most valuable resource is funding. But as people like Josh and I talk to them, we help them realize that funding essentially affords them time, and time is their most valuable resource. If they have infinite time, then they can adjust and adapt and generally figure things out until they have a viable and scalable business. Unfortunately, if they run out of time, they have to pack up their toys and go home, and that's not fun. And because of this sense of time and how much cash do I have and when are we going to run out of time, they develop these unbelievable survival instincts. We sometimes refer to a startup or a founder as being in cockroach mode. They have to go into this mode that is just for pure survival. Can you imagine how many founders and how many startups have been in survival mode for the last few months from the pandemic? If they hadn't learned this skill before, many of them are learning it right now. In fact, a lot of startups are learning unbelievable, valuable lessons because of the situation they're having to deal with the pandemic. And this is one of them. They have itchy trigger fingers. They like to get down a path very quickly. There's not a lot of strategic planning. They don't lock themselves up in conference rooms for multiple days on end to come up with some grand plan and figure out what they're going to do next. That is what big companies do. And those of you that work for mid-sized and larger companies, you're totally familiar with that. Founders get an idea, and it's just as quick as they can get down a directionally correct path, they're going to get down that path. And they don't start with this grand plan. They literally start putting some things together, and it starts to take shape as they're executing. And that's really different than many other environments that we've been in if we're not operating in a startup. And part of the reason they're able to do this is they have a special tool that large companies don't have. See, large companies only have GPSs, and GPSs dial in unbelievable levels of precision. That's all that planning that takes place. And there's a reason why large companies have to do that for most of what they do. A startup only uses a GPS for things like financial accounting and legal matters, and that's only if they have experienced advisors that are yelling at them to have those levels of precision with things like financial accounting and legal matters. Almost everything else, they just use a compass, just directionally correct. Which way? Northeast, let's go. I don't need to know exactly precisely 10 degrees northeast, 100 meters, down the road. Just northeast, yep, let's go. And that's a unique advantage they have versus really big companies. And in the very beginning, as they're thinking about building a product, they learn about a minimum viable product. A minimum viable product is the most minimal thing that they could build that validates some key assumptions about the problem they're solving and maybe the market that they're serving. It might kind of look crappy, might be expensive, something that they're going to throw away. The image you see here, if you remember Google Glass from about 7 years ago, or maybe 7 or 8 years ago, yeah, this might be some kind of early prototypey MVP version of Google Glass. And because they're experimenting so much, because they're getting down these directionally correct paths as quickly as possible, it means they are going to need to develop a superpower of being flexible, adjustable, adaptable. They very quickly learn about the concept of a pivot. And the pivot is what happens when an important aspect of their original business plan, some original assumption they were making, turns out to not be true. And as a result of that, they can either shut everything down, or hopefully, many times, there's an opportunity to make an adjustment to that business plan. And we call it a pivot. Think of it as a course correction. And most startups do numerous pivots. It's really more of a question of, is it a minor pivot or a major pivot? Major pivots definitely consume funding, and it could cause a company to crash and burn if they don't have enough funding to execute through a pivot. But it's a natural, normal course, normal speed for a startup to do a pivot. The best of them also learn that they need diversity of thinking amongst the early teams. So as they go from 2 founders to 4 employees to 6, if they all think and act the same, if they're all the same persona, actually they're going to be sub-optimized, and usually great things don't happen. It works best when multiple successful personas come together. I wrote an article titled The 8 Personas of Successful Entrepreneurs. It took me about a year to write the article. Not to write the article, but to think about what I felt were the most successful personas that I have observed and worked with as entrepreneurs. And then mixing those together to create a high performance team is part of the magic. They learn that you shouldn't care about who gets credit. It is not about a promotion. It's not about a pay raise. That's the way big companies think. When you're in a startup, it is all about survival and success of the mission. So everybody has to carry weight. In fact, every early employee and founder wears so many hats, it's hard to even say, who's our marketing person? What are you talking about? Gordon does marketing and sales, and he fills the coffee machine, and he also, manages our Amazon hosting environment or whatever. So it's all about success of the mission. And because of this focus on the mission, the concept of failure is really different in a startup. And again, I love quotes by now. This is one I love from Thomas Edison. He said, "I never failed once. It just happened to be a 2,000-step process." So that brings in both the concept of how entrepreneurs think about failure or don't think about failure, and think about that iterative process. And the truth is, if it doesn't work out, yeah, I mean, it might have died, but is death of a startup venture the same as failure? Yes, the mission failed, but I don't necessarily think that that means that the individual failed. There are certain startups that just don't belong, don't deserve to be viable and scalable companies. And it might even be just because they're way too early. The world was not ready. So I often use the words, it didn't work out, rather than it failed. And especially as I think about the individuals contributing to the startup venture, I don't think as much in terms of failure. I think in terms of it didn't work out. And you know what? When it doesn't work out, you can just shut it down and you can try again. If you can figure out early enough that it is not a viable business that you're working on, you can shut it down with minimal time and minimal capital wasted. And if you enjoyed it, you can do it again. And you can do it again until you do come up with that venture that is viable, scalable, sustainable, has a ton of happy customers, a ton of happy employees, and a lot of satisfaction along the way. Just go back to the coffee shop, do it again. So I hope that was helpful. Hope that sets the tone for the other presenters to tell their story. I hope that gave you some ideas for some questions that you'd love to ask my partner, Josh Baer, to get his perspective on those. Just put those in the Q&A feed if that conjured any questions that you'd like his perspective of. Jay, Jessica, back to you.
Gordon, thank you very much. For everybody who's attending, keep in mind that Gordon will be on for the Q&A that's 45 minutes long. So make sure and ask questions of Gordon, of Josh, and of the other upcoming speakers. With that, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, a good friend of mine, Harold Ingersoll. And I always characterize Harold's presentation in the context of Gordon's going to tell you how to create a company, Harold's going to tell you how to manage it, manage the money, Kirk's going to tell you how to protect the IP, and Harold always corrects me and says, I'm not going to tell them how to manage their money in 5 minutes. I'm going to tell them what mistakes not to make. And my reply to him today was, that's probably the first step in managing your money, is don't make mistakes. So let me turn it over to Harold and have him take it away. Thank you very much for joining us again this year, Harold. Thank you.
You bet, Jay. Thank you very much. So I've got 5 to 7 minutes to tell you about all the mistakes, or the 8 mistakes that I see that startups make. You can't usually do much in 5 to 7 minutes, but I'll do the best I can. So the first mistake I see is choosing the wrong legal entity for tax efficient treatment. There's C corporations, there's S corporations, there's partnerships, there's limited partnerships, there's LLCs. All of those have tax benefits and consequences. And depending on your goals and your situation and the number of people you have involved, one or more of those might be most appropriate for the tax structure of your business. The second one is not keeping up with accounting and retaining documentation. Accounting records need to be kept as you go. You wouldn't believe how many I see where, especially startups, it's the end of the year, it's tax time, and that's when they start doing their accounting. It's a little late at that point, because if there's something you can't find or you can't remember, it isn't going to come back to you a year later. The third one is not asking for professional help before and after the startup. One of the things that I like to say is, don't try doing everything yourself. Be willing to let go of some things. Most startup entrepreneurs, my experience is they like to have their hands in everything. And unfortunately, sometimes you just can't be good at everything. You may find that you don't have good title to your intellectual property. You're going to hear from Kirk about that in a few minutes, but many times just in doing the accounting, we discovered that you don't have good title to it because the way the transactions took place. And then we can refer you to somebody like Kirk. The fourth one is blending personal and business finances. Get a business checking account from the very beginning. Get a business credit card. Even if it's a personal credit card, that you only use for business, use that credit card. Don't use your personal credit card and your own checking account to run all of the business transactions through. Number one, the IRS loves tearing stuff like that apart because it makes it really difficult to distinguish business from personal. The fifth is not deducting business expenses or not deducting them properly. So thinking about meals and entertainment, fixed asset purchases, research and development costs, and startup costs, all those have to be accounted for differently, and they're all deducted differently. So knowing about that, you don't necessarily learn that by doing your tax return on TurboTax. Not using the right tools is the sixth, and basically what we mean by that is using the wrong accounting system. You may think QuickBooks is the best way, or you may think a spreadsheet is the best way. And the reality is, if you've not done it before, you don't know. And that's what we're here, is to help you figure that out. 7, not paying taxes timely and not understanding the obligations. You know, there's quarterly estimated tax payments. There's payroll tax deposits if you have employees. There's payroll taxes in general, unemployment taxes, state income taxes. Knowing which taxes apply to you and the deadlines for depositing and or paying those taxes is very important. You can get in trouble real fast by missing deadlines or not knowing you had a tax that was due. Number 8 is probably the biggest one that I see in startups, and that's not recognizing when you have a phantom income transaction. And basically what that means is many founders, they've put a lot of labor into developing intellectual property. Then they start up their company, they transfer that intellectual property into it in exchange for stock. And before they did that, they've already got investors who have valued the stock, and they're recognizing ordinary income in exchange for that intellectual property and or labor. And you never got any money, so you're not able to pay the tax. Those things can be avoided, but you need help to figure it out. Basically, that's it. Those are the 8 biggest accounting and tax mistakes startups make. Thanks. Jay, back to you.
Oops. Thanks, Harold. So remember, Harold's going to be on for the extended Q&A as well. I appreciate Harold not enumerating how many of those that I have made with him before, but Harold's a good person to talk to about all of these things. Ask questions about that. One of the things that my friends have commented to me about startups in Austin is they have great ideas. They have pretty good business plans. They have terrible operating plans and finance plans, and often forget about the whole return to investor part of it, the pitch it all. So we've got people on this call who can help you with all of that. And thank you, Harold, for sharing the top money mistakes that a lot of tech startups usually make. With that, I would like to turn it over to Kirk Cesari. Kirk Cesari has been with the Austin Forum on the advisory board for a long time, and he's going to talk about how to protect your IP. So Kirk, let me turn it over to you, and I'll cut my video off. Whoops. Sorry. 1 second here. 1 second, Kirk. My screen is messing up. There we go.
That's the first slide.
Right there.
Thank you, Jay. So protecting intellectual property is always a very important aspect of a startup. And so I'll just review what types of intellectual property we have. Generally, most people will interact with trademarks, copyrights, and patents. There's also trade secrets and a few other, lesser known types of IP. But trademarks are typically used to protect your brand, protect the source and identification of a company for what they're using in a commercial setting to sell their stuff. And copyrights are used to protect creative works. This is typically your software, art, photography, any type of creative designed materials that are either digital or non-digital works can be protected by copyrights. And there's lots of different statutory ways to do that. And then there's patents, which is most of the work I do. And those are used to protect inventions that inventors have for useful inventions. Again, this can be mechanical, electrical, software, and things like that. Trade secrets are used to protect valuable secret information that your company might have. And so each of the first three, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, have a registration system, and they can be done at different times. But similar to what Harold was discussing, if you do it incorrectly, you can create a lot of problematic issues. So each of these things can be done on your own, but by doing the incorrect things, you may lose the rights that you have in them. And so for a trademark, the potential loss and one of the major issues is if someone else registers first. So if someone's thinking about a startup, and your trademark is usually one of the first things people work on, is what is your branding going to be? And as soon as you have that portion down, you may want to consider filing an intent to use trademark application. If you don't do it and you start putting out your idea with your branding on it, someone else may go and grab that trademark real estate, and there may be very little that you can do about it. And if you fill out the trademark forms improperly and file it, it will also cause problems that are harder and more expensive to fix later. Copyright, same thing, very complex forms to file your own copyright. Once someone's done it a few times, they can understand it a lot better, but by not filing your copyright, you may lose your statutory damages. You can't file a lawsuit without the registration. However, depending on what you're building, whether it's software, maybe you have a blog, maybe you have a lot of design artwork, the cost of filing multiple copyrights very regularly can add up very quickly. So there needs to be some strategic consideration of when to do that. And patents, if you disclose your idea and you don't file publicly, and you don't file it, you can lose your right to do that. Public disclosures can really harm your potential patent rights. And also, if someone else files before you, you may not be able to get a patent also. And with trade secrets, you need to have company policies that actually inform employees and partners what is the protectable secret and what the policy is to protect it and enforce that policy. Because if you don't actually enforce your policy and label things as trade secrets and make a distinction between information that is valuable and not valuable as a trade secret, you may not actually have any trade secret protection. We'll go to the next slide, Jay. And the most overlooked issue for startups is in trying to manage the different types of intellectual property is actually your contracts. Although the formation agreements, the employment agreements, independent contractor agreements, and your partnership agreements, if you're bringing people on board to create intellectual property, anything that might be a copyright, a trade secret, anything that might be patentable, you need to have a contract that actually assigns that to the business entity. If that isn't there, the company may not and likely does not own that intellectual property, whether or not they paid for it. And this is something that I work with clients. It can be fixed afterward. It can be fixed down the road. However, it's harder and more expensive to do later than upfront. And typically, if a startup is looking to do an exit strategy of an acquisition from a larger company, they have to go through a due diligence process. And in that due diligence process, there may be hundreds of questions into what were these agreements, who owns the IP. They may be looking back 5, 10, 15, 20 plus years and asking for every single one of these agreements from anyone who has ever pitched in on your team. And the last due diligence I helped on for a company had over 500 line item questions for the lawyers and accountants and the partners to go through and answer for the acquiring company. So all these types of agreements typically will have IP, intellectual property sections that cover what is needed between whoever you are engaging. And you need to really examine whether something is being created, and that if you are having someone create something for your company, you need to have an agreement in place to make sure your company owns that. Next slide, Jay. But doing that can get very expensive. With all of the costs for contracts, you may spend a few $1,000s. Patents can get very expensive. The average cost is $10,000 to $20,000 for a single patent. Copyrights and trademarks are a little cheaper, but you may easily spend $500 to $1,000 or $2,000 per copyright or trademark. So you need to manage your legal costs strategically with what your goals of your startup are. And finding a lawyer that can help you determine when to spend the money to manage the risk that the legal risk has is the best thing you can do from a legal perspective. And you'll likely want to talk to a business lawyer, because for instance, I'm an intellectual property lawyer. I don't do business entity organization. And so you need a business lawyer. And that is typically what I tell clients that come to me first are, do you have your business organized properly? What is that business, and where are we assigning the IP? And then we start going through the list of, do you have the contracts for your independent contractors, for your employees, for your partners? Then we start looking at, what are they creating? What is their timeline for having a product out? When are they starting marketing? When are they doing pitches? Can they get NDAs? A lot of times you can't get NDAs. So do you want to get your IP filings done before you start pitching to investors? Because then you can protect the trademark, you can file the copyright, you can have at least a provisional patent application on file before disclosing your ideas to others. So you can protect yourself, even though maybe an investor might not sign a non-disclosure agreement. Next slide, Jay. And so I created a checklist here. We've already reviewed a few of these, but this is just some very broad items that almost every company needs to go through to start up as a legal checklist. You need to form the company. You need to have your agreements in place, with partners, with employees. You may need an employee handbook or a policy manual, depending on how many employees and what type of work you're doing. You need independent contractor agreements. You might need license agreements, if you're working with other entities. In terms of use privacy policies, if you're creating online systems where you're going to be collecting people's information, there are a lot of rules you now have to comply with compared to even just a few years ago. You have to consider your IP filings, and I actually put that lower down on the list. You need some of these other things taken care of first. You need to look at, is the industry you're going into, is there a lot of compliance or government approvals? And then you need to do some of the items that Harold discusses. You need to look at your accounting and taxes. Are you complying with the laws on those? So, and I just saw a question pop up. It is, some of this will vary depending on the type of company that you're organizing, but this is the order in which I would typically evaluate with a client. Do they have these things done? And are these, going to be, how are you going to do this, and when are you going to do them? They might not all need to be done at the exact same time, because they can, again, get very expensive. But one of the major mistakes I see startups doing is not considering a legal strategy and having a legal budget, because most of these things, especially if you're a tech company, you need these. These will have to be done. So these have to be put into the plan and the budget at some time. And so starting as early as you can, working with a lawyer that will help you strategically determine that is my best recommendation. And then I think the next slide is just a few references for you. So, there we go, Jay.
Great, thank you, Kirk. And we, again, this is being recorded, so we will post the recording of this online for people to download. We will also post the slides, and 3 of our speakers have slides, so those slides will be embedded in the master deck for the event tonight. Thank you, Kirk, for sharing IP issues to watch out for. So I'm very pleased to close it with a great friend of mine, Jill Murphy of the FBI. You probably haven't been to a startups event before where one of the lightning talks was from the FBI. But if you're thinking about a tech startup, not only do you have to protect your money and not make mistakes with it and protect your IP from the usual things, but increasingly in this era, protect it from lots of interesting external threats, even protecting your data from external threats. And so to close it all up before the Q&A, I'm very pleased to introduce Jill Murphy of the FBI.
Thank you, Jay. And thanks to you and all the volunteers who put together the Austin Forum. I really appreciate it. As Jay said, I don't have any slides. And my name is Jill Murphy, and I work for the FBI. And you may be wondering why someone from the FBI is talking at the Austin Forum to entrepreneurs, startups, maybe hopeful startups, people that are thinking about becoming tech, getting into tech or innovation. And for the last, I've been with the FBI for probably 18 or so years. For the last 10 or 12, I've worked in national security. And in the FBI, you might have heard us talk about economic security is national security. You know, you may not know this, but IP-intensive industries in the United States contributed to $6.6 trillion in 2014. I couldn't find current numbers, but I imagine if it was 6.6 in 2014, and that was a 30%, about a 30% increase from 2010, I imagine we've increased at least 30% from there. So we're probably in the 7 trillion figure for IP-intensive industries in the US. And innovation and creative endeavors and entrepreneurs really drive that economy and that growth. And again, economic security is national security. And you may or may not know, but the US loses about somewhere between $225 to $600 billion, that's a B, billion dollars, a year to intellectual property theft. So that's, even if we picked a low number, let's say $100 billion a year to intellectual property theft, just imagine the schools, the roads, the infrastructure, the parks, the good things that we could do with that money if we didn't lose that. So the FBI is very interested in helping entrepreneurs in the innovation space succeed. We want you guys to be successful because your success means our country's success. You create jobs not just in the US, but you create jobs everywhere in the world. So we want you to be successful and we want those dreams to come true. So in the FBI, one, we are a free resource. So I know that this bootstrapping that Gordon talked about and being strapped for cash and just trying to make it through, we are a free resource for entrepreneurs. You're already paying us when you pay your taxes, which is very painful for all of us. But in FBI, when we think about the innovation and the tech space, we generally talk about 3 different threat vectors. Competitors, insiders, and other governments. Competitors, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. You know, they don't want additional competitors in the space. So, you know, they may try to steal or leverage or, you know, get your proprietary or IP to prevent you from getting in that space. Insiders, well, insiders could become competitors. Or they could go work for a competitor, or maybe they've had an unhappy exit from the company, and they could steal IP as a way to do damage to the company. In any case, some studies have shown that at least 25% of people, when they leave a business, actually take proprietary or sensitive data with them. Some do it, unintentionally. They email it to themselves. They're trying to work at home or whatever the reason. But the things you need to consider as you guys are developing these great new companies. And the last one's other government entities or agencies. And this one's a little bit trickier, but you imagine if you've created something or you're in the process of creating something that is worth, that has value. It's not just valuable to the US economy, it's valuable to anybody's economy. So if a foreign government or if another government could take that and use that to create jobs in their country or to advance things in their country that may feed into national security, like Josh is doing a lot of great things with Gordon over at Capital Factory in the national security space with the Department of Defense. Like foreign adversaries may look at that as a place they may want to target. So you have to be careful with your intellectual property. The good news is what you do to protect your intellectual property, whether it's from a competitor, an insider, or foreign government, are the things that you would do to protect your intellectual property. So it really doesn't matter. But so what are those things that you might consider when you think about protecting your intellectual property? Gordon has this great slide where it shows you at a coffee shop and scribbling stuff down on a napkin and so excited to get the idea down and start working on it. And, maybe you're going to Galvanize, maybe you're going to Capital Factory. But whose idea is it that's scribbled on that napkin, right? And maybe Kirk or Harold can help you work through that. But who actually owns that IP and who wants to advance it? And as you guys are starting to grow, these are things that you have to think about. Who has access to it, right? So as you're adding people to the payroll to try and build stuff out, as you're outsourcing, maybe you're outsourcing maybe some computer work to another country because it's cheaper and you are trying to bootstrap it. What do they actually have access to? What can they do with that? How are you covered legally? These are things that you have to do. So the first step is going to be to identify what is the secret sauce? What is the thing that makes your IP, your proprietary information so sensitive that if you lost, your idea would fail. Someone else took it from you. So identify the secret sauce. Like, what is that thing? And then protect it, right? It sounds simple enough. But I think when you're trying to advance this great idea forward, a lot of times thinking about the protection piece isn't really front of mind. You're thinking more about, how am I going to afford it through this next 2 weeks? Like, how am I going to pay my rent or my mortgage? How am I going to get this piece manufactured? How do I get, this whatever thing done? And you're not thinking necessarily about protecting that intellectual property. You want to think about that some in the beginning. I know that time is a very valuable resource, but if you lose that intellectual property, if you lose that idea or that proprietary information, then you lose the ability to drive this idea, this concept forward. So there are simple steps that you can take. Cybersecurity is always a big one. There's lots of quick, easy steps. You can Google most of the stuff, doing your patches and your updates and all those things. But are you storing your idea or the concept on a computer? Who has access to that computer? Are you emailing it around? Are you sharing it with investors? Someone in Austin told me, and I mentioned this when I did a podcast with Jay, that don't tell them what it does, not how it does it, right? So when you're talking to investors, don't tell them how it does it, just tell them what it does. I would encourage you on the investment side of the house, because that can be, I think, a trickier piece. Engage your network. It's a great ecosystem in Austin. You have the Capital Factory, you have Galvanize, you have ATI. You have a lot of great partners in Austin in that ecosystem. If you have investors offering you things or asking you for things, talk to your network, reach into that ecosystem and ask questions. If you're being offered a trip overseas, what is the ROI on that for the person that's offering it to you? Just be smart about the things that you're doing. The laws that we have in this country are not the laws that are in other countries. And so they may have the ability to access all your devices if you go into their country. You may not be able to use encrypted apps. You might not be able to successfully VPN out. So these are all important things to consider, especially if you're going to travel overseas with your intellectual property or sensitive data. And sensitive data, as Jay alluded, isn't necessarily just your sensitive data. It could be your contact list. It could be anything on your devices that a person or company can use to get a competitive advantage over what you're doing. So if you have any concerns, again, I encourage you to reach out to the great ecosystem in Austin and ask around. And I also encourage you to reach out to the FBI. Again, they are a free resource. We do not disclose when we talk to people, and we're happy to try and kind of talk you through or ask questions. We may not be able to share some things, or we may be able to share things and then feed that back into the ecosystem in Austin to protect others. But the FBI certainly wants to support this really strong and great ecosystem in Austin. And we want you guys to thrive, because you thriving means our economy thrives. So Jay, I appreciate the time to talk tonight, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you very much, Jill. I hope everybody got a great understanding of the big picture of creating a tech startup, and then got to hear about 3 different areas to watch out for that you sometimes don't hear about when you get that idea about creating a tech startup and get that lecture on it. So with that, let me share the screen here again. Hold that thought 1 second. We are going to back up just a little bit from here. We have Q&A coming up, but what we'd like to encourage you to do, we've been going at this for exactly 1 hour. So grab a drink, take a quick bio break, whatever you need. In 2 minutes, Josh Baer of Capital Factory is going to look through all the questions that have been submitted via the Q&A function. And we're going to bring all of our speakers live online, cut their photo streams on, and they're going to answer your questions. So you've got 45 more minutes to ask them whatever else what other questions you may have. And Josh is going to start with the questions he sees in there, but we have given Josh carte blanche to pick whichever questions he wants whenever they come in. So Josh is going to use his expertise in helping literally hundreds, and maybe by this point, thousands of tech startups to figure out which questions will be the best to add to the night. So 2-minute break, and then we'll start. And if all the presenters would put their video streams back on for the Q&A session and come off mute when you're ready, we'd appreciate it. Josh, you ready?
Oh yeah.
Good. All right. So 90 more seconds, everybody. Hope everybody gets a chance for a quick break. Look forward to hearing the questions and the answers from the panelists. Speaking of another drink.
Josh, this is when you play your music.
It's coming up. Of course, what's right in front of me right now is
It's not appropriate.
No, appropriate, but possibly dating me. So we'll just go with some summertime.
Jay, we do this a lot at our Capital Factory meetings and whatnot. In between, Josh will kick it off with some music.
We haven't been embedding music into our events. We did have Amy actually provide some live music before, one of them that was fantastic, unbelievable. I'm always
on right now too. She just thanked Bill for the cool talk. Yeah.
I just gave her a big head, I bet, but totally deserved because it was so incredibly wonderful. And I always feel guilty about asking her to set that up again, but it's that kind of thing that you know it's going to be good ahead of time, and then it happens like, oh wow, I didn't know it was going to be that good. So she did it live from her living room, and her husband's a musician too, and they had great mics set up. It was unbelievable. Amy, since you're on, and I just gave you all those props, you'll probably want to do that for the next event, won't you?
She has a show coming up too, a Facebook streaming show.
Good. right. All right. I think everybody's probably had a chance to take a bio break, uh, refill the drink, etc. We're happy to bring now to you the second part of tonight's event. So now all of these experts are here to answer your questions, led by Josh Bear, picking the questions and asking the ones that he thinks makes the most additional valuable information to tonight's event. So Josh, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jay, and great to be here with everybody and so many good friends, and then some new friends and great advice. I was in there in the chat. I saw lots of suggestions in there and was quite embarrassed about many mistakes that I have made that I could really feel and remember. But I want to start with the basics. There are a lot of basic questions in there that we can speak to that are important ones. And I want to start by picking up on Jill's topic around intellectual property and, you know, what you share, what you don't. Because as much as I love Jill, and Jill knows I love Jill, but you know, my general advice that the takeaway you'd get from talking to me about this would probably be kind of the opposite you'd get from talking to Jill, because we're focused on two totally different things. And so when I normally talk to somebody about their idea, I usually say, like, talk to as many people as you can, right? And get as much feedback as you can and be as open as you can, because that's what's going to push you forward. And most entrepreneurs don't really have any big secrets to protect. They don't actually have much intellectual property that's defendable or that they need to worry about. And they end up holding themselves back by being too secretive. But Jill's talking about something else. She's talking about when you actually do have something to protect, like maybe your code base, right? Or data about your users, right? Or credit cards, or, you know, lots of other information, or just your secret sauce, right? Of how you do it. So, you know, I think that's a great place to start. I'd love to hear, you know, certainly from Harold and Kirk, from Gordon and Jill, all of you, about how to think about the different trade-offs of what to protect and what not to protect. And so there were a few questions there like this. I'm going to pop up this one here to start, which was from Jake Mobley, one of the first ones. How, you know, do you find it's important to protect your idea legally or by withholding info while searching for mentors, support, or even capital? We've kind of talked about that in different ways. Kirk, you want to go first? How do they know what to protect and what not to?
And this is where, you know, there's no one great answer for every single company. You know, you need to find somebody, whether it's your accountants, your lawyers, and your mentors, that can help you develop a plan for what you're trying to create. And, you know, depending on what type of industry you're in will probably affect, like, should you file a patent before disclosing information to your mentors? Do you need to get those mentors in to help you construct the idea? So it depends on where you're at in your timeline for what you should protect when and how that is. And
what are some of the industries where you are more likely to need to protect it?
Well, I mean, definitely, and you start looking at healthcare, you start looking at banking, you know,
and healthcare specifically, like biotech, right? You go develop a new drug.
Biotech, you're talking about your innovations, but also, again, like you mentioned earlier, your customer data, you know, those types of things. You know, that's your, you know, that's, you know, statutorily protected that you have to do that. And so that's where compliance and governments comes in that you may have to deal with. So knowing that you're going into, say, a med tech area is, you know, very important to know, versus, oh, I'm going to develop software for a mobile app that is just a game. There may be a lot less regulation, there might be a lot less innovation. So the types of disclosures would be completely different as to when you would, you know, do that on your strategic timeline. And you know, we do a lot of work with data storage companies, and, you know, they're looking at things from, like, okay, they develop servers and hardware, but they're processing billions of people's information on that server and hardware. So we start looking at You got security systems. We do a lot of patents for encryption systems. And so at what point do you disclose what type of encryption you're implementing? Those types of issues. And that has to, that really differs depending on what the company is trying to accomplish.
Thanks. Who anyone else wanted to chime in here?
Yeah,
Jill,
Josh,
what
I'll
else
say
should
one
we-
thing, like one way to think about it maybe is I'm thinking of the many hundreds of elevator pitch workshops that you and I and the Capital Factory mentors do every year with the founders. And there should be a compatible way of coming up with a 2-sentence elevator pitch or even a 1-minute elevator pitch that describes what you do in a very compelling and clear and exciting way that doesn't trip over what we're talking about in terms of the concerns. And so if you can find a way to explain what you do in a clear, compelling, and exciting way, very short, you will get a lot of conversations with investors and mentors and partners and customers and employees. And there might be a time where that conversation gets to the level where they want to double click down and your attorney says, time out, we need to be careful. And that's the way I separate and allow those two things to be really compatible.
So that kind of leads into one of the next similar related question from Zen. How important is an internal NDA? In his case, he says when discussing with a potential co-founder, but when is the right time to use an NDA versus not, Gordon?
I mean, I just be honest with you. I'm struggling to think of when I signed an NDA, in the last couple of years. It's like real business to business kind of things, like with founders, with mentors, with investors. I just don't see it. And maybe I'm on the wrong side.
Anyone
and
else want
lawyers
to
are
throw
freaking out, but
a different perspective when it was a good time for an NDA?
Yeah, I have one. Typically, I advise clients to use NDAs when they have, again, critical information they're sharing. And so you're drilling down into the development process of the business much further than those high-level ideas. And you get to the point where you're sharing code, engineering schematics, user data, user information, client sales data, sales information, things that are really substantial. But like Gordon said, at those very high-level discussions, yeah, a lot of that might not even be confidential. But when you get down to, we have a lot of data we're sharing. We're actually opening a portal to someone to go and look at our database. Those are the types of places where you probably want an NDA in place. And there was a great question in the chat, is there follow-up required for an NDA? Well, it's not required, it's a contract, and they typically don't include clauses about follow-up in them. But a company, if they're sharing really critical infrastructure information on what the company is doing and planning, they should be on the lookout to make sure to see if they feel like the party they're sharing it with might be sending it to someone else or using it in an unauthorized way. And that's when you would want to start an investigation if they did really get that feeling.
Jill, what do you want to make sure entrepreneurs are most focused on protecting and being careful about?
I think you're right, Josh. I think it's the secret sauce. So I think that Gordon makes a great point on the elevator pitch. You should be able to do an elevator pitch without sharing the secret sauce. But I do think that there is an important piece of sharing that's necessary to get advice from the people in your network. The thing that I would suggest is that once you've figured out what that secret sauce is, what that special thing is, and recognizing that, like a lot of investors won't sign NDAs because they want to hear about what's going on with the product. I think it's important to engage the network that you have, right? So if there were a member of Capital Factory, I would expect them to talk to you and Gordon. If they were a member of ATI, I'd expect them to talk to Mitch, and find out the track record for the investors, and for the questions that they're asking. Is it the first time that they're asking questions about investing in this type of tech, or is this a consistent thing that they've done with investments in this tech? Like, does it make sense logically, the things that they're doing, just to make sure that you're being smart about what you're sharing. So talk to people that have experience that are in the field.
Yeah. And Jill, this is not a hypothetical, right? Like, you're not like worried about maybe someday someone might try to steal something, right?
No.
Like this is coming from real places, right? Like you see this stuff happening.
Yes, we see this stuff happening. Yes, and I can give you a real life example without naming any companies. I recently heard about a company that's in the biotech space that had a foreign company or foreign country that I'm not going to name that wanted to do a virtual tour of their space, and then also started asking them questions that was really outside of the realm of what they were doing about pen tests and cybersecurity protocols that they had, right? So to me, it was questions that they were looking to set themselves up to do a cyber attack on this particular company that's developing biotech that's of interest. So I think that, and that's just an easy example. We see great, smart innovators invited overseas and intellectual property stolen. Other countries have other laws. So I think that people just really need to educate themselves and be careful. And
hey, can we fly you to come speak at this conference? We'll pay for your ticket and put you up your hotel and
yeah. And what's their ROI on
free
that?
Wi-Fi.
Yeah, free Wi-Fi. Exactly. Yeah. So I encourage people to reach out to Josh and his team and the network there in Austin.
All right. Well, the next question from our good friend Patricia that I think kind of builds on this one. It says, how important is it to communicate clearly with stakeholders, including being honest about when and where help is needed? This gets, we're talking about NDAs and what you disclose and what you don't. Lots of entrepreneurs that I speak, most entrepreneurs that I speak to, everything's great. This is the best company ever, and things are going so well. How do you balance that? Harold, you got any advice? We got you on here?
I'm on now.
All right.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to unmute, sorry.
That's okay.
That's kind of out of my area. I see what's practiced, and many times you've got the entrepreneur that is the ever optimist and doesn't ever see any of the possible fallacies or pitfalls that may be coming down the road. And they need somebody on the other side of that to kind of pull them back to reality. And then I see them, the pessimists, and they seldom succeed. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And I just know what I see. I've been an entrepreneur myself. I've always been the optimist. But I always make a point of finding somebody to be the realist to work with me on it. So don't know if that helps.
Gordon, I know you see this a lot. What do you think?
Well, I have two things that I expect. And one is I like updates like clockwork. If I see 3 monthly updates or 12, and then I don't see one for 2 months, I know what happened. Things went bad. And I want to know when they're bad. So I want to see them like clockwork. And then the second thing is I want them to be balanced. I want to really understand what's going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Start with how we can help. There's got to be some ways you can help. I want to understand how things are going, both the good and the bad. So I like it like clockwork. And if things are going bad, that's fine. I get it on the second day of every month, and you're going to tell me things just went to hell, and here's how I need help. And then I'm going to watch the recovery. This is a best practice with all of your stakeholders, including the investors. I know you think that the investors don't want to hear when things go bad. They want to understand what's really going on so they can understand you all as the founders of the company. And are you being honest? Are you reaching out for help when you need to? You will earn more credibility as the investors see you go through bad times and then recover. Like, it is an unbelievable credibility builder versus trying to hide it when things go bad.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think most entrepreneurs clam up. Things aren't going well. They don't want to talk about it. It's kind of a pain in the ass, right? Like, you send an email out saying you're having problems. Suddenly you get all these phone calls from all these people that want to talk about it. And you want to fix it. You want to focus on it. And maybe it doesn't always feel like help, right? But that's manageable. And there is help in that. And usually talking to people does help. And more importantly, it's a lot of it's about expectation setting. And if you just don't say anything, and then suddenly things get really bad, and the first thing people are hearing is, wow, you know, the last thing they heard was everything was great, and now, wow, things are terrible. Like, they're like, what do you mean? What happened? I thought things were great. Like, you lose a lot of credibility. And whereas if if you've been saying like, hey, like I've been sending updates that they've been having challenges, then if things do end up getting bad, then people are much more understanding because they feel like they've been on that journey with you and part of it. And then as you turn things around, people are impressed, and they see, what you've done, and they see what you've come through. And, I'll say, for me, having worked with people multiple times now, having invested in people multiple times, I thought you learn so much more about someone from how they fail than from how they succeed, right? Like, it's easy when everything works out right. It's easy to do things right. It's easy to be good when things are going well and you're making a lot of money and you've got lots of resources and it's easy to fundraise. And you learn much more about people's character and how they handle things when they, face challenges, right? And how do they communicate when things aren't going well? And how do they handle themselves if things don't work out? And I've many times, made a decision that I'm definitely going to invest in someone again based on how they failed, and said, wow, if that's how they fail, I definitely want to invest in them again because I trust them and I know they're going to be a good steward, and they're less likely to fail from the way, what they're clearly learning going through this. Good question, Patricia. All right. Here's the one that, Jill touched on. So we'll start with you, but I bet there's some other perspectives on this. And this is from Charlie Valdez. What due diligence should you do before sharing your idea or approaching potential investors? How do you due diligence your investors? We always hear about investors due diligencing you, trying to figure out if they should invest in you. How do you due diligence them?
So that's a great question. I'll give you my perspective, but I've never had an investor. So, so look, from my perspective, I think that, again, you use the network in Austin. I think I would want to know, if it were me, the questions I would be asking is, does this make sense? If I say I'm doing biotech, is that the investment stream that they normally do? Is this a known VC? What other investments have they made? What are my legal lanes, my right and left limits? Like, what do they want access to before I do the pitch? What insurances do I have from them that they're not going to take my idea? Have they had any history of doing that? Who actually invests in that VC? So what's behind that door? So one of the things that I would wonder about is there foreign investments in that VC that will then have access to my intellectual property or my proprietary information, and that they may create a competitor company overseas that may be able to undercut the value of what I'm trying to create in the States. And so those would be some initial things that I would think through. And then, of course, I would engage, the Joshes, the Gordons, the Jays, the Mellies, the Mitches of Austin to see if they have any experience with this investing group.
Yeah, so, it's most investors don't ask to see your source code. Most investors don't see really sensitive information. It's not unthinkable if you had a deeply technical product that somebody might not need to do some due diligence and look at it, but you should be, looking carefully at that. Jill's probably a little more careful about naming countries or things like that, but Chinese investors are a red flag and can cause, not separate from them even having any nefarious intentions, which there's well-documented cases of them having nefarious intentions. Just the fact that you take a Chinese investor can later on prohibit you from being able to do business with certain customers in the US government or others that are not allowed to do business with China. And you can certainly imagine some other countries that would have similar kinds of restrictions. And so there's going to be some, that are, countries that are well understood, that have really good rule of law, that have great relationships with the US, where you're going to be much less concerned. And there's others where you probably want to look a lot more closely. Diligencing them, the first thing is like the same thing you do with anybody, right? Talk to people they've worked with. that's the same way you do any of it. And the best way to diligence an investor is to talk to CEOs that they've invested in. And like, again, with anybody you diligence, preferably ones where things didn't go right. So go find a company that they invested in that failed. That's the best reference. Like if they got a good, they'll tell you how things really went. What are other good ways to diligence investors? Anybody?
That's the big one, Josh. The last piece you said is talk to other founders in startups that it didn't go well. It didn't have to fail, but did it go through a rough patch? And how did the investor?
What would be a sign of it going through a rough patch? What would you look for?
The basics would be just, you set a plan this is more with institutional.
What could somebody outside see?
What's that?
What would somebody outside be able to look for? Like, oh, let me look through their portfolio. Who should I talk to?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, a layoff, like a company that had to go to a layoff, not during times of a pandemic.
Yeah.
You don't have to know what their financial plans are, but they went through a layoff. Did the CEO or some other founder get ousted from the company? And there might have been a totally legitimate reason. Many times there are reasons, but
so a new CEO coming in,
new CEO, new executive, or a replacement kind of thing. Recapitalization.
Go talk to the old CEO. If he has nice things to say, that's unusual already right there. That's a pretty good sign. If he has bad things to say, he or she, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing either, because lots of people might not, aren't happy at the end of it. But that's exactly a great reference point.
Yep.
Anything else?
Those are the biggies, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So go look through their portfolio. Just like if you're hiring somebody, like don't just take the references they give you. Like it's okay to reach out directly to someone that they've invested in and say, hey, I am talking to this investor about making an investment. I see that you got an investment from them. I was hoping you might talk to me for a few minutes about it. People will do that. All right, we've got time for a couple more questions. So there's a lot more questions in here. So let's see. Here's another good one from Patricia. At what point should founders set up a board? What do you all see? When's the right time to think about your board as a startup? Harold, do most of the companies that you work with as startups have a board?
Usually it's the investors. And I'm
the investors are the kind of the initial board.
I wouldn't call it a formal board. Some do, but most just seem to have an informal board. It depends on how early stage they are, obviously. But at some point, they do formalize it most of the time, if they make it to that point.
Gordon?
The way I think about it is, the board has a kind of a pure and basic legal context in the early days, right? There's things that need to be properly papered up and approved, and that's kind of one phase. And then there's this phase where you see that you might actually be a Series A funded company in the next 6 months or a year and a half. And I always recommend that startups in that phase start practicing a board meeting like they're a Series A investor. I've had the privilege of joining 2 boards of directors in pre-Series A startups, and to their credit, part of the reason why they wanted to bring me on their board was not just to be a more involved advisor. They wanted me to help them get ready to be a Series A company. They didn't want to get Series A funded, have their first board meeting with a new lead investor on their board and some independent that they may or may not know, and that's the first real board meeting. So there's a real opportunity, and it's not just to go through the motions. There are certain valuable things that can happen in a board meeting if you're doing it right. So if you find somebody with experience before your Series A, it's probably one of your early advisors. They already know you, they already love you, they already want to help you. You ask them to join your board well in advance of raising your Series A round. You say, can you help us figure out what the hell is a real board meeting? Can we do a few of those before we actually bring on a Series A investor? What's going to happen is now the Series A investor comes, onto your board, and yes, some things might change a little bit, but you've already been practiced. I think it's extremely valuable. And then every board meeting is, is different, and your investors and participants, they'll have their way that they like to conduct the meeting. I'm less worried about kind of how the meeting is conducted. It's more about kind of the governance and the responsibility that comes with operating and managing a board.
All right, I got one that I know I have an opinion on, and I'm curious what Harold thinks. This is from Jake again. Are there any advantages to a particular bank for startups or small businesses? Any particular recommendations?
It's not the bank so much as it is the banker, has been my experience. Most bankers don't understand startups. That has been my experience. And, most startups, they just go to a bank, they open a checking account, and that's all they really want from them. They don't think about long-term relationship necessarily. So I just recommend that you shop bankers. Many times you end up following the banker from one bank to the other, but it's the banker that has the savvy, that understands what a startup does. And those are hard to come by, but there are several around. At least
So that's a great point, and I agree with you. What's an example of like a problem that you need a banker for?
Well, let's say you need a loan.
You want to get a loan.
If you need a loan, I was actually having a talk with a startup earlier today who was dealing with a banker who was telling him that taking a large amount of depreciation on his tax return was going to hurt his chances to get a loan, which meant to me the banker didn't understand that it should be based on cash flow instead of net income. But that's one to avoid. That was my advice. And I know some that get all that, and I'm referred them.
Right, so they understand how to work with small businesses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I run into, I'm sure there's bankers maybe on the line here, but a lot of bankers like to be the gatekeeper instead of the helper. And I look for the helpers. That's what advisors are supposed to be, and bankers are no different.
Yeah, my experience with a lot of the tech companies that we work with, they don't qualify for loans of any kind. They don't have any assets. They, at the stages we're working at, they really just wouldn't qualify for traditional loans. So they don't have much need of a banker.
Right.
And that's particularly why I'm a big fan and use Chase Bank. And it's just because I just think they have the best online banking. So I can do the most without the banker. I can do everything online. I can set up wires. I can delegate stuff. I can do whatever. So it lets me be really efficient as a small business owner. But like you said, about the time you really want to start talking to bankers is when you need a line of credit, when you need a loan with the PPP. Now, hey, when the PPP hit, it really helped to have a banker, to have a banking relationship. That was a place just recently where people who had a banking relationship were really thankful if they were trying to get a PPP loan because they had somebody to help them get through that. But that's the first one. Is a rare that that's not a common occurrence. That was obviously a pretty unique case.
It's not.
Great. Jay, are we going? I don't remember. Are we going to 7:45 or 8?
Yeah, you've got about 9 more minutes, so you could probably get 2 or 3 more questions in.
All right, we got a couple more questions. Well, there's plenty in here, including an anonymous tip from a Chinese attendee, which we'll send to Jill, and I'm sure she'll love. I see her laughing at.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
All right, I knew you'd appreciate that one. Okay, so let's see what else we got in here. There was a question here that I know was a good one for Gordon. What challenges are unique to hardware or device startups? They're very unique. My favorite saying I'll just throw out is hardware is hard. Gordon, what else you got that's better than that?
Well, I spent about 2/3 of my 28-year career before Capital Factory in hardware companies, and a majority of the gray hairs that you see on my head and the scars that if I took off my shirt you would see in my body are from those hardware companies. And that's because hardware companies get the pleasure of being both a software company and a hardware company. So you get all the fun trials and tribulations of building a great software company, but you get a bunch of other fun stuff that get layered on top because of being a hardware company. I find that the most common mistake startups make being a hardware company is they focus almost only on the electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, and physical product, building the product. They then build a, interesting version 1 of the product, and they quickly realize once they start selling it that 90% of the rest of their success is all related to the supply chain. And I tell founders that before you get a product on the market, your most valuable hire for software companies, oftentimes their most first real valuable hire is that full stack engineer or that software architect. And you go find the greatest badass that you could find, and they are a difference maker in the company. The equivalent of that in a hardware company is your supply chain professional. If they have a lot of scars on their body, that's who you want. You want somebody that has screwed up a lot of imports and exports and obsolescence on components and redo of injection molds and back and forth to different countries. And there's a saying that we have in the hardware world called labels and cables. Startups that are in hardwares, you'll be amazed how much time you worry about small little cables and the label you put on a box and the size of the box and how you fit those boxes into overpacked boxes so you can ship. And it just doesn't make sense until you've been in that movie, but just trust me.
Thank you, Gordon. Yes, hardware is its own unique beast.
So John, I could chime in. So I think that a couple of things that I've seen on the questions dealing with working with the government. So if you're doing a startup, and you mentioned this earlier, if you're going to work with the government, you have to be concerned about who you're doing business with or who your investments are from. But as Gordon just mentioned, the supply chain. So you also have to be concerned about your supply chain and who is supplying different parts depending on what it is that you're building. So those are things that you got to think about, because if you want the government to at some point purchase whatever it is that you are making, even if it's just a small portion of what you're selling, and a lot of it's in the commercial space, but you do want to sell to the government, those are things that you should be considering up front.
Yeah, and that's been a real issue. That's been an issue in virtual reality. There was a company that was getting a lot of press called Magic Leap that the Department of Defense was looking at doing a big, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars contract with. And then they took a big investment from China, and suddenly Microsoft got the deal. And then, another example is the domestic drone industry. Drones are such an important, part of our national defense strategy now. That's kind of like the transistor radio of airplanes. They've kind of come up from the bottom, but they're a real issue. And there is very little U.S. domestic supply chain. And almost every drone you buy is full of parts made in China, and many of those parts report back to China. So now suddenly we can't use those drones for national defense or other things. And so we need a U.S. supply chain. We need U.S. companies building all the different parts we need for a drone. And we didn't quite see that one coming. What's the next thing like that coming? Is there another example, Joe?
No, I think drones for me is a great example. Because if I have my history right, I think drones were created in Austin by a guy who graduated from UT.
It wasn't everything created in Austin by a guy or girl who graduated from UT.
Sure. Maybe.
I mean, this is where what starts here changes the world, right?
That's right.
Well, the 5G scenario is similar to that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Although a lot
What's that one?
Yeah, I do wonder about 5G, because now I hear people talking about 6G, and I feel like we haven't got to 5G. I know that we also talked about flying cars, and I think Japan is maybe taking the first step towards that. But people say flying cars are going passe now. So it's a good question. What is next?
Yeah.
Is it quantum, Jay?
Well,
maybe that's a good question to wrap up with. Let's ask everybody what you think. What's next? Jay, what's next?
Well, funny that Jill mentioned that. We actually have Worley coming on to present in November about quantum computing, and I think there's a lot of room in the AI space in general We're at the very beginning of deep learning, reinforcement learning, generative adversarial networks, et cetera. So I think the next 5 years are going to be years in which the AI hype dies down, but the AI transformation really hits hard. But 5 years is about that time, I think, for quantum, Joe. I think
Worley's always doing what's next. Who else? Joe, what do you see happening next that you're allowed to tell us?
I mean,
It's not national
I think
security.
that quantum is a big concern. I think the biotech space that you guys talked about is also a concern. I mean, look at this pandemic. Like, what does that make us think about for the future? I mean, look at what Elon Musk just did with a neural sensor, right? Or is it super soldier and CRISPR technology? I think these are all great questions. It's hard to say what's next, but I think it's all important for us to focus on and be careful with.
Kirk, what are you seeing?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of clients. It's all about security. It's going to be hardware security, software security, encryption, and more as everything goes forward.
I think they'll definitely need more of that. Harold?
I don't see a lot of technology specifically. For me, the next thing is the September 15th and October 15th deadlines for taxes. But I agree with Kirk about the cybersecurity. I think that's actually, it's probably not the next big thing. It's probably the big thing right now.
Awesome. Gordon?
Well, I'm personally involved and on the board of directors of probably the most advanced robotics company in Texas. It's a capital factory portfolio company called Aptronic. And just what I get to see that they're doing is just so mind-blowing, amazing. I mean, I really believe that within a few years, there will be, walking robots coexisting with humans and doing unbelievable things. And what I see is mostly positive. I realize with internet and AI and other things, you get the good and the bad. And of course, I'm an optimist, so I see these young founders doing unbelievable things and their potential in robotics. I'm just excited that I get to live through a whole new massive evolution. Those of us that were in business when the internet came about, we're going to get to see 2 or 3 of those again in our lifetime, and I think robotics is going to be one of them.
Awesome. Jessica, do you have any ones to add?
I will, nothing more to add. No, I think all of these are really great answers. So.
Josh, what do you think about green technologies?
Green technologies?
Yeah, someone
Clean tech?
Clean tech, yeah.
I think more so than ever. It's been a long time coming, like a lot of these things, but I'm certainly seeing more of that than ever and more practical than ever. But that's a slow moving one. Awesome. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you having us here, Jay, and the conversation, and getting to see Jill since she moved from Austin to Baltimore not so long ago, and we miss her, and getting to talk to everybody else. And Jay, I'll hand it off back to you.